My sick brother expects me to donate my kidney and sells my inheritance behind my back, but I discover his scam at the last minute and end up leaving him on the street. My older brother, Marco, is sick. He has chronic kidney failure, and according to the doctors, his life depends on a transplant. There's no way around it. If he doesn't get a compatible kidney soon, his days are numbered. When I received the news, my first reaction was a whirlwind of emotions. Sadness, fear, confusion, and if I'm completely honest, a pang of resentment. I know how that sounds and I'm not proud, but if you knew the family dynamics I've lived with my whole life, maybe you'd understand why I'm not running to the operating room with open arms. Marco has always been the golden child of the family. No matter what he did or how many times he messed up, my parents, especially my mother, defended him as if he were a saint. And it's not like I've been a saint either. In fact, it's been quite the opposite. Since we were kids, Marco knew how to manipulate every situation to his advantage. If something broke, I ended up being punished because, according to him, it was my idea. If he got bad grades, it was because I didn't help him enough. If he ever needed money, he asked for it with a dazzling smile that made it impossible to refuse, even if you knew he wouldn't pay it back. I grew up in his shadow, being the responsible brother while he did as he pleased. And now here we are. His life is at stake, and the whole family expects me to be the hero, the savior, the brother who gives him his kidney without thinking twice. It's not that I don't want to help him, but why does it always have to fall on me? Donating an organ isn't like lending him money to pay off a debt or letting him use my car. It's irreversible. It's a huge sacrifice, one that will affect the rest of my life. And the worst part is that I don't even feel like this is a choice. The pressure is constant, as if I'd already signed an invisible contract to save him. My mother gives me no respite. Every time we talk, it's a monologue about how family comes first and how Marco would do the same for me, although we all know that's not true. She's told me so many times that I no longer know if she really believes it, or if she just wants to convince me. Marco, for his part, acts as if the decision has already been made. We've barely spoken directly about the subject, but his attitude says it all. It's as if he's already assumed that I'm going to do it, as if my kidney is something that rightfully belongs to him. He hasn't even tried to thank me or acknowledge what this would mean for me. For him, it seems to be just another formality. And as if all this weren't enough, there's the matter of the inheritance. My father passed away a few months ago, and although his loss was hard for everyone, he also left a significant legacy. A house that has belonged to our family for generations. It's a beautiful property full of memories, with a history that my grandfather always said we should protect. Although I don't live there because I have my own life in another city, I always thought that house would be something Marco and I would share. A bond that would keep the family together even after our parents were gone. When my father passed away, Marco offered to take care of everything related to the inheritance. According to him, I was too busy with my work and my life in another city to worry about the legal procedures. First, it didn't seem like a bad idea. I'm not an expert in these things, and Marco, being the older brother, seemed like the right person to handle it. But now things don't add up. Every time I try to ask about the documents, about how things are going, Marco changes the subject. He tells me not to worry, that he's taking care of everything, but that phrase sounds more like a warning than reassurance. A few days ago, while talking to my mother, she mentioned something that left me stunned. She said that Marco had been talking about selling the house because he needed the money to pay medical expenses. I had no idea about this. Nobody consulted me. Nobody informed me. And when I asked Marco directly, he simply said that it was necessary and that he didn't have time to consult me because things moved quickly. Something is not right. I know him well enough to know that this has nothing to do with medical expenses. Marco has never been good with money, and I have a feeling that he's using his illness as an excuse to justify something bigger. But here I am trapped. On the one hand, I feel that if I refuse the transplant, the whole family will condemn me. My mother has already called me selfish for even hesitating, telling me that if anything happens to Marco, it will be my fault. On the other hand, I can't ignore the feeling that Marco is manipulating all of this, as he always has, and that this time the price to pay will be too high. Not only my health, but also the part of my inheritance that rightfully belongs to me. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I'm being paranoid or if there really is something else behind all of this. The only thing I know is that my family expects me to be the savior, but no one seems to care about what I'm sacrificing in the process. I feel lost. Update 1. It's been a while since I first wrote, and things have taken a turn that, honestly, I never saw coming. After many sleepless nights, I decided that I couldn't ignore the red flags about the inheritance any longer. I couldn't let the issue of the family home go because every time I thought about it, something inside me screamed that Marco wasn't playing fair. So I did what anyone in my situation would have done. I sought professional help. I hired a lawyer. It was a decision I didn't take lightly. My family isn't particularly wealthy, and what little I have I've earned through hard work. But honestly, I felt like it was my only option. During the first meeting with the lawyer, I explained everything. How Marco had taken charge of the procedures, how he kept me in the dark, and how my mother had casually mentioned that he was thinking of selling the house. The lawyer listened carefully, asking specific questions that made me realize how little I knew about the process. He asked me if I had signed any documents related to the inheritance, and I told him no, at least not that I remembered. That was the first red flag. With my authorization, the lawyer began to investigate. It wasn't long before he called me with news that in any other context would have been surreal. It turns out that, according to legal records, I had signed documents transferring ownership of the family home to Marco. The problem, of course, is that I never signed anything. My signature had been forged. When I heard those words, I felt the ground open up beneath my feet. I couldn't believe it. I knew Marco was capable of many things, but this was another level. Forging my signature to keep the family home wasn't just a betrayal, it was a crime. The lawyer assured me that this was a clear case of fraud, and that I had every legal reason to sue him. But that didn't make me feel any better. In my mind, images of our childhood played on a loop. Marco and I playing in the yard of that same house, my mother baking cakes on Sundays, my father fixing things in the garage. How could he do something so low with something so important to our family? I decided to confront him. I'm not someone who enjoys confrontations, but I couldn't stay silent. I called him on the phone first, trying to stay calm, but when I mentioned the forged signature, his response left me speechless. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try to feign surprise. He simply said, "It was the logical thing to do. You don't even live here. Besides, I needed the money for my treatments." His tone was so casual, as if what he had done was completely reasonable, even noble, as if I was the problem for questioning him. That moment changed something inside me. For my whole life, I had let Marco get away with things because he always found a way to justify his actions, and I always ended up giving in. But this was different. This wasn't a simple loan that he would never repay, or a lie to avoid punishment. This was outright betrayal. And worst of all, he didn't even show an ounce of remorse. After that call, things got even more tense. My mother, who was already aware of the situation, didn't support me. Instead of being outraged by what Marco had done, she told me to understand his desperation, and that it wasn't the time to fight over material things when Marco's life was at stake. Basically, she was telling me to let the fraud go and focus on donating my kidney. According to her, that was what was important. I didn't know what was worse: the fact that Marco had stolen the house from me, or that my mother was justifying it. I tried to explain to her that what he had done was illegal, that he had crossed a line that I couldn't ignore, but she simply replied that I was being selfish and that I should think about the family. That phrase haunted me for days. Think about the family. Was anyone thinking about me? About what I was sacrificing both emotionally and physically? As all this was happening, the pressure to donate my kidney only intensified. My mother called me almost every day to ask if I had made a decision yet, while Marco continued to act as if everything was settled. Every time I talked to him, he mentioned things like "when I finish the operation," or "when all this is over," without even giving me the opportunity to express my own thoughts or concerns. It was as if my body no longer belonged to me, as if I were simply another resource for him to use at his convenience. In the midst of all this, my lawyer continued working on the case. He told me that he had enough evidence to take Marco to court, but he also warned me that it wouldn't be easy. My family, especially my mother, would probably turn against me. I knew he was right, but I also knew I couldn't stand idly by. It wasn't just about the house. It was about me, about my right to be treated with respect, about not letting Marco continue walking all over me as he had done my whole life. Making the decision to sue my own brother was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Not because he didn't deserve it, but because I knew what it would imply. I knew this would fracture our family even more than it already was. But in the end, I understood that I had to do it. For the first time in my life, I had to choose myself. Update 2. A few weeks have passed since I made the decision to sue Marco, and honestly, I wasn't prepared for what came next. As predicted, my whole family turned against me. Well, all except a couple of cousins who know Marco and his habits well, to put it mildly. But most, especially my mother, practically declared me persona non grata. It's incredible how, despite having all the evidence that I was the victim of fraud, they managed to turn it into a story where I'm the villain and Marco is the victim. First, I tried to talk to my mother again. I wanted to calmly explain why this was so serious for me, and how it wasn't just about the house but about the principle of things. I told her that Marco had no right to forge my signature, to steal something that belonged to both of us. But she simply refused to listen. Her response was word for word. Your brother is sick and you want to drag him through court? What kind of person does that? And there I understood it. For my mother, no matter what Marco does, it will never be his fault. There will always be an excuse, a justification. But he did it because he had to. The calls from my mother, which before were to pressure me about the kidney, now became a combination of pleas, insults, and emotional manipulation. One day she begged me to withdraw the lawsuit, saying that family should resolve things amongst ourselves, not in court, and the next she accused me of being a bad son, a selfish person and insensitive. In her mind, it doesn't matter that Marco robbed me. I'm the one to blame for not letting it go. Meanwhile, Marco also decided to make his move. I guess, feeling cornered, his only way out was to become even more manipulative. He started telling everyone who would listen that I was trying to steal his inheritance. Yes, he was saying that. According to his version, I was jealous that he was my mother's favorite, and I was using his illness as an excuse to take everything. Hearing those lies made me sick. For years I had put up with his manipulations, but this was a whole new level of audacity. The worst part was that many people believed him. Some family friends, people who have known me since I was a child, started calling me to tell me that I was going too far, that Marco already has enough with his illness. They even accused me of acting out of revenge, as if I were a monster incapable of empathy. It was exhausting. Every day I woke up feeling like I was fighting a war, not just against Marco, but against a narrative that he had built in his favor, and that everyone seemed to accept without question. On the other hand, I decided to go ahead with the kidney issue, but not in the way everyone expected. I went to the hospital to get more tests and find out if it was really a viable option for me to donate. The main reason was simple. I needed to know if I had a medical excuse to stop all this pressure without looking like the villain of the story. What I discovered was something that somehow gave me a sense of relief and at the same time filled me with concern. It turns out that my health isn't as good as I thought. I have hypertension, something I'd never taken seriously, and according to the doctors, donating a kidney could be a significant risk for me. When I received the results, I felt a strange mix of emotions. On the one hand, I was relieved because now I had a legitimate reason, backed by doctors, to refuse the donation. On the other hand, I realized how little I had taken care of my body during all these years, how I had been so busy with my work and family responsibilities that I had ignored the warning signs. But most importantly, this gave me the opportunity to stand up to my family and say no, without the crushing guilt they had tried to impose on me. When I told them about the results, my mother reacted in the worst possible way. Instead of being concerned about my health, she simply said, "That's an excuse. Doctors always exaggerate those things. If Marco were in your place, he wouldn't think twice." That phrase hurt me more than I can explain, not because it was true, but because it made it clear that my well-being had never been a priority for her. For my mother, I was just a resource, something that could be used to save her favorite son. Marco, of course, didn't react any better. He called me furious, saying that I was making up illnesses so I wouldn't have to help him. It was a speech full of resentment, as if I owed him something, as if my whole life was meant to revolve around him. At that moment, something inside me broke. I had spent my whole life trying to keep the peace, to not make waves, to avoid family conflicts. But now I saw clearly how unfair it all was. Marco hadn't just robbed me. He was willing to destroy me emotionally to get his way. Despite all the pressure, I decided to go ahead with the lawsuit. I can't describe how difficult it has been to stand firm in the midst of all this turmoil, but I know it's the right thing to do. My lawyer assured me that the evidence is overwhelming and that we have a solid case. But still, I can't help feeling like I'm fighting a battle completely alone, with everyone around me ready to attack me the moment I let my guard down. This situation has made me question so many things about my family, about what support and unconditional love really mean. I always thought that despite our differences there was a bond that held us together, but now I realize that that bond only existed as long as I was willing to give in, to sacrifice myself, to be the one who always put others above himself. Update 3. The conflict with Marco reached a critical point, as if everything was destined to explode sooner or later. When I formally filed the lawsuit, it unleashed a storm that no one in my family seemed prepared to face. Although deep down I knew the reactions would be extreme, what I didn't expect was how far Marco would go to try to get away with it, and how much more painful this whole process would become. For starters, as soon as Marco received the legal notification, he began a smear campaign against me that made it clear how desperate he was. He not only told all our relatives that I was suing him, something they already knew, but he started making up stories to paint me as a heartless monster. He said that I had always been envious, that I had never supported him, and that now that he was fighting for his life I was trying to ruin him. He went so far as to say that the lawsuit wasn't about the house, but because I wanted all the inheritance money for myself. He even made up that I was spending our father's money on lawyers to drag him through the mud. At first, I didn't know how to deal with these lies. There were relatives calling me and scolding me, asking me how I could be so cruel to my own brother. People who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly had the moral authority to give me lessons on family and brotherhood. Even some of my mother's friends started to get involved, telling her that I was ungrateful, and that I was causing unnecessary suffering to someone who was already going through so much. All this made me feel like I was fighting against an avalanche, as if it didn't matter how much evidence I had or how legitimate my reasons were. Everyone had already decided that I was the bad guy in the movie. But what hurt me the most was when my mother decided to officially take sides. One day, while I was in a meeting with my lawyer, I received a text message from her that simply said, "I hope you're satisfied. You're killing your brother." That phrase paralyzed me for a few minutes. I didn't know what to do. It was as if everything I had feared from the beginning, the absolute rejection of my family, had become reality. I tried to call her to talk, but she didn't answer. When I finally managed to communicate with her, she made it clear that in her mind, Marco was the victim and I was the aggressor. She said that if anything happened to Marco, it would be my fault, and that she could never forgive me. After that call, I realized something important. I had nothing left to lose with my family. For weeks, I had been walking on eggshells, trying to maintain a minimal relationship with them while fighting for what was mine. But that call freed me from that burden. If my own mother was willing to blame me for everything without even trying to understand my perspective, then there was no reason to keep seeking her approval. It was painful, but it was also a kind of liberation. For the first time in my life, I felt I could fight for myself without worrying about pleasing others. Meanwhile, the case against Marco progressed, and with each step more details were revealed that made me wonder how I hadn't seen this coming before. My lawyer discovered that Marco hadn't just forged my signature to transfer the house to his name, but that he had already sold the property to a third party without telling me anything. The worst was discovering what he had spent the money on. It wasn't for medical treatment or to improve his quality of life while battling his illness. He had used much of the money to pay off gambling debts. Yes, gambling. Marco, the man who had convinced the whole family that he was desperately trying to save his life, had been gambling while I was dealing with the pressure of saving him. When my lawyer showed me the evidence, bank statements, suspicious transactions, even online betting records, I felt a mix of anger and sadness that I can't describe. It wasn't just the fact that he had stolen the inheritance. It was the fact that he had used his illness as a mask to cover up his addiction and his problems. While everyone saw him as a victim, he was destroying everything around him, and he didn't even have the decency to admit it. I decided to confront him one last time, not because I expected him to admit his guilt or show remorse, but because I needed him to know that he couldn't control me anymore. I met him at a cafe in a neutral place and told him everything I knew. I showed him the evidence and made it clear that I wasn't going to stop the lawsuit, that this time I wasn't going to give in. His reaction was predictable. He got furious, accused me of being obsessed with ruining his life, and of course tried to blame me for everything. But what surprised me was his total lack of shame. He didn't try to deny it or justify himself. He simply told me, "You've always been bitter. This house was never really yours. I'm just taking what belongs to me." That was the last time I spoke to Marco outside of the legal context. After that conversation, I decided to close the door completely. I knew I wasn't going to get any kind of repentance or reconciliation, and I didn't want to continue feeding his narrative that I was the bad guy. Instead, I focused on the case, gathering all the evidence and preparing everything for the trial. It was difficult, especially because my family kept update for. The trial finally took place, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it was one of the most tense and emotionally exhausting moments of my life. From the moment I entered the courtroom, I knew that everything that had happened in recent months was coming to a climax. The looks from my family, especially my mother, were like daggers. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. Her disapproval was evident, and for a moment I wondered if I was ready for this. However, remembering everything Marco had done, all the manipulation, the lies, and the abuse of trust, I knew there was no turning back. The case itself was solid. Thanks to my lawyer, the evidence of the forgery was undeniable, and the fact that Marco had already sold the house without my consent further complicated his situation. My lawyer presented bank records, legal documents, and even witnesses who confirmed that the signature on the transfer papers was not mine. One of the most shocking moments was when a handwriting analysis was shown, demonstrating without a doubt that Marco had forged my signature. I remember how he tried to remain calm, but his face betrayed him. You could see fear and rage mixing as he realized his game was coming to an end. Of course, Marco wasn't going to accept defeat without a fight. His lawyer tried to argue that everything he did was out of desperation, that his illness had led him to make impulsive decisions, and that he never intended to harm me. But my lawyer was prepared for that. He presented the evidence of the gambling debts, the suspicious transactions, and the expenses completely unrelated to any medical treatment. It was a devastating blow. Marco's narrative as the desperate victim crumbled in a matter of minutes. The hardest part of it all was listening to his testimony. Marco, being the expert manipulator that he's always been, tried to appeal to the emotions of everyone in the room. He talked about his illness, about how he felt abandoned by me, and even went so far as to cry while saying that all he wanted was to save his life. It was hard not to feel some empathy because after all, he is sick. But even at that moment, I knew those tears weren't sincere. They were another tool in his arsenal, another attempt to manipulate the situation in his favor. And to be honest, I think at some point during his testimony, even he realized it wasn't working anymore. The judge wasn't swayed. After hearing all the arguments and reviewing the evidence, he ruled in my favor. Marco was found guilty of fraud, and the sale of the house was annulled. Technically, this means that the house is mine again, although now there are legal complications with the buyer, who will have to be compensated by Marco, not by me. The judge also ordered Marco to return my share of the inheritance, although considering his financial state, we all know that's never going to happen. When the verdict was read, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. On the one hand, I had recovered what was mine. I had shown that Marco couldn't get away with it this time. But on the other hand, I knew that this triumph came at a huge emotional cost. My relationship with my mother and much of my family was completely broken. When I left the courtroom, my mother completely ignored me. She simply left with Marco, murmuring something about how justice doesn't understand the value of family. It was painful but not surprising. Marco, for his part, had nothing to say to me. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and defeat, but didn't say a word. I think deep down he knew he had nothing more to use against me. His lies had been exposed, and his reputation, even among some of the relatives who supported him, was completely shattered. I watched him leave the courthouse with my mother, and that was the last time I saw him in person. Since then, things have been strange. The house, although technically mine now, is in an emotionally complicated state. My mother asked me almost immediately after the trial to let Marco stay there for a while until he could get back on his feet. I was surprised that she had the nerve to ask me that after everything that had happened. When I told her no, that the house was mine and that Marco would have to find another solution, she became enraged. She told me that I was being cruel, that family should always come first, and that I was proving to be just as selfish as I had been all my life. It was a short conversation, but it made it clear that my mother and I were on opposite sides of a chasm that would probably never close. Marco, according to what I've heard, is living in a small apartment that my mother is helping him pay for. Apparently, he's still having problems with his debts and his health, but I no longer feel the same burden of responsibility as before. I spent too much time sacrificing myself for someone who never valued me, and now I'm focused on recovering my peace. Moving back into the family home has been a complicated process. Every corner is full of memories, some good, others painful, but I'm starting to feel like this place is finally mine. I've begun to renovate it, not just physically but also emotionally. For the first time, I'm making decisions for myself, without worrying about what Marco or my mother might think. It's liberating. Although sometimes the loneliness weighs more than I expected, this trial marked a before and after in my life. I lost a lot, but I also gained something I'd never had before. The ability to defend myself, to choose myself over others. Now I'm determined to build something new, something that doesn't depend on manipulation or constant sacrifice. For the first time, I feel like I'm really starting to live. Final update. After everything that happened, I thought I had finally closed this chapter of my life. I had recovered the house, I had left Marco's manipulations behind, and although the relationship with my mother and much of the family was still broken, I was learning to accept that distance as part of the price for having defended myself. What I didn't know, what I could never have anticipated, was that Marco still had one last play up his sleeve. And this time, his betrayal surpassed everything he had done before. A few weeks ago, while reviewing the final inheritance documents and doing some paperwork related to the house, I received an unexpected call from my lawyer. His usually professional and calm tone had a note of urgency that put me on edge. He told me that he had discovered something during the review of the financial files related to the sale of the house. According to him, there were suspicious movements in a bank account that was linked to Marco, but also to my mother. First, I thought there was a mistake. My mother? What would she have to do with this? My lawyer, aware of how delicate the matter was, asked me to come to his office to review everything in detail. When I arrived, he showed me documents that confirmed the unthinkable. My mother not only knew about the forgery of my signature and the illegal sale of the house, but she had helped Marco plan it. She had been his accomplice from the beginning. I couldn't believe it. As I looked at the bank statements showing transfers between Marco's account and my mother's, I felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Everything started to fall into place. Her insistence that I understand the situation, her constant defense of Marco, even her disproportionate anger towards me every time I tried to defend myself. It wasn't just that she was supporting him as a mother, she was protecting herself. Because if everything came to light, she too would be exposed. The betrayal hit me harder than I ever thought possible. For months I had believed that Marco was the only culprit, that he was the manipulator, the architect of this whole nightmare. But now I saw that my own mother, the person who should have been on my side, had been helping him all along. Beyond the money and the house, what hurt me was the level of deception, the coldness with which they had lied to and used me. My lawyer told me that with this new information, I could include my mother in the lawsuit for complicity in the fraud. It was a difficult choice, but after much thought I decided to do it. It wasn't a decision I took lightly. I knew that this would mean definitively breaking any remaining bond with her, but I also knew that I couldn't let this go unpunished. They had stolen something that wasn't just mine, but represented generations of sacrifices from our family. I wasn't going to allow them to get away with it, no matter who was involved. When my mother received the legal notification, her reaction was explosive. She called me immediately, yelling that I was a disgrace, that she couldn't believe I was doing this. I tried to remain calm as I explained that I had proof, that I knew what she had done. But she denied everything. She told me that I was being manipulated by the lawyer, and that I didn't understand what I was doing. But what really froze me was when, at the end of the conversation, she said, "All of this was for your brother. I was just trying to protect him. You never understood him because you've always been selfish." That phrase stayed with me for days. I couldn't understand how someone could justify something so horrible with that kind of logic. Protect Marco by robbing me, by betraying me? No matter how hard I tried to make sense of it, I couldn't. It was as if all the love and respect I once felt for her had vanished in an instant. The legal process against her and Marco moved quickly, partly because the evidence was overwhelming. The judge had no sympathy for their argument that they did it all out of desperation. Both Marco and my mother were found guilty of fraud and sentenced to pay compensation, although I know I will never see that money. Marco, who was already drowning in debt, had to face bankruptcy proceedings, and my mother, who had always depended on my father's inheritance to support herself, found herself with nothing. What happened next is what really changed the course of everything. Marco and my mother, unable to accept responsibility for what they did, tried one last desperate move. One night when I was at the house, someone tried to break in by forcing the lock. The alarm went off and I called the police. What I never imagined was that when the officers arrived, they would discover Marco and my mother trying to get in. Both were arrested on the spot. That was the moment when everything ended for them. Not only had they lost the inheritance, but they now faced additional charges for trespassing and vandalism. It was a nosedive for both of them, but for me it was the closure I needed. Finally, after months of fighting, I realized that there was nothing left to save in that relationship. They had made their choice and I had made mine. Now I am rebuilding my life in the family home. It's a slow process, but every day I feel like I'm recovering a little more of myself. I've cut off all contact with Marco and my mother, and although there are days when sadness overwhelms me, I know I made the right decision. I don't regret having fought for what was mine, nor for having set limits with those who harmed me. This experience taught me that sometimes family isn't determined by blood, but by the people who truly care about you.